Dun, 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 dun. Somebody questioned me a few days ago. They said, well, I heard something about your church from time to time. This was when I was out and about. And I said, well, what do you do there? I've heard a lot of different things. I said, well, they're probably all true. But if you want to know what my right now present point of view is on what we're doing here, is that we're engaged in a process you might call ego destruction. That works for me, okay? And we do that through dialogue and practices that lead to a series of insights culminating in the maturation of the ego-based identity into a deeply meditative unitive experience where opposites are reconciled in the clear, spacious vision of the witness nature. Ta-da! Yeah, that just kind of popped out and came through. We are engaged in a process of ego destruction through dialogue and practices that lead to a series of insights culminating in the maturation of the ego-based identity into a deeply meditative unitive experience where opposites are reconciled in the clear, spacious vision of the witness nature. Oh yeah. I invite you to the party. Well, we're not the only people who've ever engaged in processes like that. A fellow named Andrew Sullivan, who's a commentator on the scene out there, he's had some great ideas. I ran across some of his stuff just a few weeks ago, and I thought maybe let me share some of it. He began this one particular column with the idea that Christianity has been destroyed by politics and priests and get-rich evangelicals. Ignore them, writes Andrew Sullivan, and embrace him, meaning the Christ consciousness. If you go to the second floor of the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., you'll find a small room containing an 18th century Bible whose pages are full of holes. They are carefully razor-cut empty spaces. So this was not an act of vandalism. It was rather a project begun by, who knows who? Thomas Jefferson, when he was 27 years old. Painstakingly removing those passages, the ones that he thought reflected the actual teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. And Jefferson literally cut and pasted them into a slimmer, different New Testament, and left behind the remnants. And all of this is on display. What did he edit out? He told us. We must reduce our volume to the simple evangelists. Select even from them the very words only of Jesus. And he removed what he felt were the misconceptions of Jesus' followers, expressing unintelligibly for others that they had not understood themselves. And it wasn't hard for him. He described, and this is like, I can't imagine doing this. Well, I can imagine doing it, but I think the response would be pretty interesting. He described the difference between the real Jesus and the evangelist's embellishments as diamonds in a dunghill. Wow. That's kind of saying it like it is, you know. Glittering as the most sublime and benevolent code of morals which has ever been offered to men. Yes, he was calling vast parts of the Bible religious manure. That's a gutsy guy for that long ago. When we think of Jefferson, as the great architect of the separation of church and state. This perhaps is what he meant by church. The purest, simplest, apolitical Christianity, purged of the agendas of those who sought to use Jesus to advance their own power decades and centuries after his death. If Jefferson's greatest political legacy was the Declaration of Independence, this pure, precious, moral teaching was his religious legacy. I am a real Christian, Jefferson insisted, against the fundamentalists and clerics of his time. That is to say, a disciple of the doctrines of Jesus. And what were those doctrines? Not the supernatural claims that, fused with politics and power, give successive generations wars, inquisitions, pogroms, reformations, and counter-reformations. The doctrines of Jesus were the practical commandments, the truly radical ideas that immediately leapt out into the simple stories he told and which he exemplified in everything he did. Not simply love one another, but love your enemy as well. And forgive those who harm you. Give up all material wealth. Love the ineffable, that wonderful, ineffable being behind all things. And know that this being is actually your truest Father, in whose image you were made. Above all, give up power over others. Above all, give up power over others. The command and control syndrome, if it is to be effective, ultimately, desires require the threat of violence. And violence is incompatible with the total acceptance and love of all other human beings. That is the sacred heart of the Jesus teaching. And that's why, in his final apolitical act, Jesus never defended his innocence. Remember that in trials? The chief Pharisee, the chief priest, high priest, Caiaphas, I think it was. We can't say, you hear what they say against you, don't you have a response? And Jesus would say nothing. They say so, he would say. They say it's what they say. They say so. And that's why. That's why. And he even turned to those nailing his hands to the wood on the cross and forgave them and loved them. Can you, in your wildest imaginations, imagine being there and being subjected to that kind of act and then saying what? Do you remember that memorable saying? Forgive them, Father. They know not what they do. To be there. To be there. That's something to long for. Whether or not you believe in Jesus' divinity and resurrection, and in the importance of celebrating both on Easter, Jefferson's point is crucially important because it was Jesus' point. What does it matter how strictly you proclaim your belief in various doctrines if you do not live as those doctrines demand? What is politics if not a dangerous temptation toward controlling others rather than reforming oneself? If we return to what Jesus actually asked us to do and to be, rather than the unknowable intricacies of what we believe he was, he actually emerges more powerfully and more purely and more intensely relevant to our times. Jefferson's vision of a simpler, pure, apolitical Christianity couldn't be further from the 21st century American reality. We inhabit a polity now saturated with religion. On one side, the conservative base is made up of evangelical Protestants who believe that religion must consume and influence every aspect of public life. On the other side, the last progressive primary had candidates profess their faith in public forums, and more recently, our beloved president appeared at the National Prayer Breakfast invoking Jesus to defend his plan for universal health care. Go. Interesting that it's come there. The crisis of Christianity is perhaps best captured in the new meaning of the word secular. It once meant belief in separating the spheres of faith and politics. It now means, for many, simply atheism. The ability to be faithful in a religious space and reasonable in a political one has atrophied before our eyes. You hear that? That capacity. Meanwhile, organized religion itself is in trouble. The Catholic Church's hierarchy lost much of its authority over the people when the unilateral prohibition of the pill in 1968, how many remember that? Oh, that created a bit of a firestorm since 95% of the people were using it. And all of a sudden, it was taken away from them by Pope Paul VI. But in the last decade, whatever shred of moral authority that remained has evaporated. The hierarchy was exposed as enabling and then covering up an international conspiracy of abuse. Countless youth and children suffered. I don't know what greater indictment of a church's authority there can be, except a refusal even now of the entire leadership to face their responsibility and resign. Instead, they obsess about others' sex lives, about who is entitled to civil marriage, and about who pays for birth control and health insurance. Inequality, poverty, even the torture institutionalized by the government after 9/11. These issues attract far less of their public attention. And for their part, the mainline Protestant churches, which long ago promoted religious moderation, have rapidly declined in the last 50 years. Evangelical Protestantism has stepped into the vacuum, but it has serious defects of its own, as New York Times columnist Ross Douthat explored in his unsparing new book, Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics. Has anybody read it? I've looked into it. It's an indicting piece. How we became a nation of heretics. Many suburban evangelicals embrace a gospel of prosperity. This really hit home with me. A gospel of prosperity which teaches that living a Christian life will make you successful and rich. And there's no greater proponent of that than that fellow down in Texas, Joel Osteen, I think it is. And that's the essential tenor of all of his lessons. Get right with God and you'll be rich, have everything you want. Okay. Others defend a rigid biblical literalism, adamantly wishing away a century and a half of scholarship that was clearly shown that the canonized Gospels were written decades after the ministry of Jesus, and are copies of stories told by those with fallible memories. Still others insist that the earth is merely 6,000 years old, seeming to completely renounce the idea that carbon dating has any efficacy. Just say it's so. Yeah, something we now know by the light of reason to be not true. And what group of Americans have pollsters found to be most supportive of torturing terror suspects? Those good old evangelical Christians. Torture them. Something has gone very wrong. These are impulses born of panic in the face of modernity and fear before an amorphous other. This version of Christianity could not contrast more sharply or strongly with Jesus' constant refrain, be not afraid. Be not afraid. Get out of that head creating anxiety. Be not afraid. And what's going on now, the writer contends, would make Jefferson shudder. It would also, one imagines, baffle Jesus of Nazareth. The issues that Christianity obsesses over today simply do not appear in either Jefferson's or the original New Testament. Jesus never spoke of homosexuality or abortion, and his only remarks on marriage were a condemnation of divorce. now commonplace among American Christians, and forgiveness for adultery. The family, well, you remember he disowned his parents in public as a teen and told his followers to abandon these spiritually uninformed ideas that they espoused. Sex, he was a celibate. Oops. Try that one on. Who, along with his followers, anticipated an imminent end of the world where reproduction was completely irrelevant. I have to go there sometime. All of which is to say, something so obvious it is almost taboo. Christianity itself is in crisis. Amen. It seems no accident that so many Christians now embrace materialistic self-help rather than ascetic self-denial, or that most Catholics, even regular churchgoers, have tuned out the hierarchy in embarrassment or disgust. Given this crisis, it is no surprise that the fastest growing segment of belief among the young is atheism, which has leapt in popularity in the new millennium, nor is it a shock that so many have turned away from organized Christianity and towards spirituality. Co-opting or adapting the practices of meditation or yoga or wandering as lapsed Catholics in an inquisitive spiritual desert. The thirst for God is still there. How could it not be? When the profoundest human questions, why does the universe exist, rather than nothing? How did humanity come to be on this remote blue speck of a planet? What happens to us after death? Remain as pressing and mysterious as they've always been. And that's why polls show a great majority of Americans still believing in a higher power. But the need for new questioning of Christian situations and institutions, as well as ideas and priorities, is as real as the crisis is deep. In regards to that, I would stay posted. The best is yet to come. With that, no thank you. Thank you, guys.